The content on the Untold Tales channel is protected by copyright. Unauthorized use may result in legal liability. The phone rang abruptly, yanking me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, an all too familiar number. It was my son. Dad. A choked sob came through the receiver. Dad, come get me. I tensed instantly. My little boy's voice was trembling, thick with fear and tears. Danny? Where are you, son? What happened? I was already on my feet, heading for the door. They took me. Another sob. I don't know where I am. Please, Dad. My breath hitched. A lump of rage and panic tightened in my throat. But before I could respond, another voice cut in, harsh, cocky. Kevin, good to hear from you. I assume you figured out by and now that your boy needs your help. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. Who are you? What do you want? I ground out through clenched teeth. Oh, it's simple, my friend. $5 million. Cash. Or your boy never comes home. I heard a muffled cry from Danny, followed by soft whimpers. Don't you dare touch him. I roared, my veins turning to ice with dangerous fury. The stranger chuckled. Oh, what a fierce daddy you are. Don't do anything stupid, Kevin. You have 24 hours. I'll be waiting for your call. The line went dead. I stood there, gripping the phone, my pulse hammering. One thought pounded in my head. They took my son, and that was their biggest mistake. I clutched the phone so tightly that the silence around me was shattered only by the frantic beat of my heart. The world shrank down to a single, all-consuming thought. My son was in the hands of those bastards. Danny was everything to me. The only thing left of her, of Rachel. He had her smile, her soft but piercing gaze. The same green eyes I once drowned in. When Rachel was gone, I thought life had lost all meaning. But then Danny spoke his first word, took his first steps, and I knew. I lived for him. Now he was gone, taken, and I was powerless to change it. I inhaled deeply, forcing back the surge of rage and despair. I had to act. First step, talk to Victoria. Victoria had been with me for 3 years. I knew she tried, did everything she could to be a good mother to Danny. And he loved her, though not the way he loved Rachel. No one could ever replace his real mother. I entered the house, tension wrapping around me like steel chains. Victoria stood in the kitchen, dressed in a long silk robe, steeping tea. She looked up and immediately sensed something was wrong. Kevin? Her voice wavered. What is it? You look pale. I didn't waste time. They took Danny. My voice was hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. Victoria's eyes widened, and she clutched the cup tighter. What? Who? I threw my phone onto the table, as if trying to rid myself of this nightmare. They called me. Danny was crying, begging me to take him home. Then I heard the kidnapper's voice. They're demanding $5 million. I have 24 hours. Victoria collapsed onto a chair, pressing a hand to her mouth. Oh God, Kevin, what do we do? I ran a hand over my face, the black void in my chest expanding. I'll call the police. We'll get the best people on this. Track these bastards down. No. She cut me off sharply. I looked up. Her eyes were wide with fear. We can't take that risk, Kevin. You know what this could mean. If the police get involved, they might do something awful to Danny. I clenched my fists. Victoria, I can't just sit here and do nothing. But you can pay. Her voice shook. You have the money. It's just money, Kevin. Danny's life is priceless. I turned away, staring out the window. The lights of Los Angeles flickered in the night, but I felt like I was standing on the edge of an abyss. You know, if we give them the money, it won't be the end. They might ask for more. Or worse, they might not let him go at all. Victoria stood, walked over, and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. Kevin, I can't imagine what you're feeling. But please think of Danny. He's alone right now. He's scared. If you call the police, you could lose him. I closed my eyes. In my mind, I heard his voice. Dad, come get me. Fine, I said finally. I'll give them the money. But I won't just sit back and wait. I'll find out who they are, and I'll make them regret what they've done. Victoria nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes hadn't vanished. I had no fear, only rage. I went upstairs to my office, opened the safe, and started laying out stacks of banknotes onto the desk. $5 million in cash. It wasn't much for me, but this wasn't just a sum. This was a ransom for my son's life. And those bastards might not stop there. I couldn't just hand over the money blindly. I knew how this game was played. They would get exactly what they demanded, but only on my terms. I needed insurance. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized for years. The line rang a few times before a familiar rough voice answered. Kevin, holy shit. Long time no see. His voice carried genuine warmth. I thought you'd fallen off the radar. Vince, I said, my tone steady but tight with tension. I need help. Serious help. There was a pause. Then his voice turned sharp, all business. Talk to me. I gave him the rundown. The kidnapping. The ransom. The fact that I couldn't just hand over the money and hope for the best. These bastards think they can call the shots. I finished. But we both know there are no guarantees in situations like this. Vince let out a heavy breath. You're right. They could take the money and dispose of the witness. Or demand more, seeing that you're willing to pay. You need leverage, Kevin. Exactly. I need your help. Where do we meet? My place. In an hour. I'll be there. The call ended. I sank into my chair, laced my fingers together, and lowered my head. My mind was racing, my heart pounded, but I couldn't allow myself to break. Danny was waiting for me. Exactly an hour later, a black SUV came to a halt in the driveway. A car door slammed, and Vince appeared on the porch. He had barely changed, tall, solidly built, with a short buzz of graying hair, cold eyes, and that ever-present smirk. A former Marine who had been through the hell of war zones. I opened the door, and he stepped inside. Good to see you, brother, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Wish it were under different circumstances. Yeah. I gestured toward the kitchen. Come in. We sat at the table. Vince clasped his hands together, his gaze sharp and focused. Tell me what you've got. The money is ready. I nodded toward the case beside me. $5 million, just like they asked. Tomorrow at noon, they'll give me the meeting location. Good, Vince nodded. What about their conditions? They said if I get the police involved, Danny won't come back. Not surprising. That means we'll have to handle this ourselves. Any idea who it could be? No, I admitted. I have plenty of enemies, but none that would stoop to kidnapping a child. Vince frowned. Then it's either someone who knows you really well, or someone testing how far you'll go for your son. Either way, we need to be ready for anything. That's why I called you. He nodded. Got a plan? Not yet. But I'm not just handing them the money. Good call. Here's what we'll do. Tomorrow, you go to the meeting, but you won't be alone. I'll be nearby with my guys. We'll track them, see where they take Danny. If anything goes sideways, we move in. I clench my fists. If they so much as touch him, Vince smirked. They'll regret ever being born. I looked up at him, and for the first time that night, I felt a sliver of hope. These bastards had no idea who they were dealing with. I picked up my phone and dialed the number that had called me. The line rang for a long time, but I knew they would answer. And finally, that smug, arrogant voice came through. Well, Kevin, I hope you won't keep us waiting. I have the money. Where's the meeting? Oh, you're making the right choice. We like reasonable people. Write this down. Industrial Zone, Warehouse 17, midnight. Come alone. No tricks. I want to hear my son. That's not part of your terms, Daddy. Show up, and you'll see him alive. If there's so much as a scratch on him, tick-tock, Kevin. Don't be late. The call ended. I set the phone down and looked at Vince. Warehouse 17. Industrial Zone. Midnight. Vince nodded. Classic setup. Big abandoned space. No witnesses, plenty of ways to spring a trap. That's why he'll be close by. I locked eyes with him. Do you have people? Always. He chuckled. They'll be in position an hour before the meet, staying in the dark, keeping quiet. You'll have an earpiece. I'll hear you every second. If things go south, I'm the first one through the door. I gave a slow nod, hoping everything would go according to plan. Warehouse 17 stood in the industrial zone, surrounded by a rusted fence with torn wire mesh. A massive concrete structure with shattered windows, its interior swallowed by darkness, the dim glow of a few lone floodlights barely piercing the shadows. I turned onto the gravel road and cut the engine. Stepping out of the car, I felt a faint vibration in my ear. Comms check. Vince's voice was clear and steady. Loud and clear. Good. We're in position. Go. I shut the car door and made my way inside. The air was thick with dust, dampness, and metal. A few hanging bulbs cast weak pools of light, revealing the silhouettes of three men standing off to the side. One, the largest, stood in front, arms folded behind his back. "You bring the money? Where's my son?" The man smirked. "One thing at a time. The money." I clench my fists. I see Danny first. "Hey, you've got two choices, pal. Either you hand over the case, or we take it off your corpse." He took a step forward, but just then, I caught a faint rustling in my earpiece. "Kevin, two on the roof." "It's a setup," Vince murmured. I had already figured that out. With a sharp motion, I popped open the case, but instead of handing it over, I smashed it straight into the leader's face. He stumbled back, and I stepped in, driving my boot into his gut. "Shit!" One of the goons shouted, reaching for his gun. I dove to the side, grabbing a rusted pipe from the floor and hurling it at one of them. He yelped, clutching his arm. "Vince, I need backup," I shouted, dodging a wild swing. A heavy thud echoed through the warehouse, and suddenly, Vince stormed in, a pistol in one hand, and in the other, Danny. I froze. "Dad!" My son tried to rush toward me, but Vince held him firm. "Danny!" I took a step forward, but Vince raised his gun. "Hold it, Kev. Don't move." I stared at him in confusion. "What the hell are you doing, Vince?" He smirked. "Doing what I have to." My brain refused to process it. You were part of this from the start." Vince tilted his head. "You're rich, successful, too used to being in control. But here's the thing. There's too much good in your life and not enough in mine. You were my friend, you son of a bitch." Kev, he squeezed Danny's shoulder, making him cry out. "Now, I'm a businessman." I clenched my teeth, locking eyes with my son. "Danny, I'm here," I said quietly. "You want it back?" Vince tilted his head. "Triple what you were going to pay these guys. You've got the cash, no doubt about that." My fist clenched. "Or what?" Vince grinned. "Or he never walks out of here alive." And in that moment, I knew there would be no negotiations. This wasn't about a ransom anymore. This was war. I stood, fist tight, staring into the face of the man I once called my friend. Vince held my son close, using him as a shield, his other hand gripping the gun with unwavering confidence. "You still think you can weasel your way out of this, Kev?" His voice was almost amused, like this was all just a game to him. "Come on, don't drag this out. Transfer the money, and everyone goes home happy." "I will never pay you, you bastard," I hissed, feeling the rage crash over me like a tidal wave. But before I could act, the sound of measured footsteps echoed through the warehouse. The sharp click of heels against concrete rang out, bouncing off the empty walls. I knew that sound instantly. Slowly turning my head, I saw Victoria. She was flawless, as always. The dark, form-fitting dress accentuated her figure, and a barely perceptible smile played on her lips. Calm, confident, predatory. She stopped beside Vince, folded her arms across her chest, and shook her head. "Oh, foolish Kevin," she murmured, her voice low, almost affectionate, yet laced with something cold. "Did you really think you could get out of this?" I stared at her, unable to believe my own eyes. "Victoria." I breathed her name as if hoping this was all just some horrific nightmare. She smirked and stepped closer, pulling a phone from her purse. "Come on, Kev, let's not turn this into a spectacle. We both know this is the end. Just do what you need to do. Here's the account." She turned the screen toward me, displaying the banking details. "Call your bank and confirm a transfer." I swallowed hard, my gaze darting to Danny. He was terrified but trying to stay strong. I could see the way he clenched his teeth, fighting back tears. "Why?" My voice came out hollow. "Why?" Victoria arched a brow, then shrugged. "Oh, Kevin, you gave me every reason. You were so sure of yourself, so obsessed with your work, with always being in control, that you didn't even notice the obvious. I was always there, and you were somewhere far away. And you," my eyes flicked to Vince, something cold twisting in my chest. "You're with him, of course." She smiled wider. Who else could understand me better than Vince? He was everything you stopped being, Kev. He didn't treat me like I was invisible. "You bitch." She laughed. "Maybe, but I'm a realist. And right now, the reality is that you have only one choice if you want Danny to walk out of here alive." "You seriously think I believe you?" I narrowed my eyes. "You want me to just send the money and walk away? No, Victoria. I know exactly what happens next. The moment you get what you want, you'll get rid of us. She rolled her eyes. God, Kevin, you're so predictable. Do you really think your life matters to me? I only care about the money. Pay up and go live your miserable little life. I stayed silent, feeling something inside me crack. I had trusted her, let her into my life, believed she could be part of my family. And all this time, she was just waiting for the perfect moment to drive the knife into my back. Vince chuckled. How long are you going to stand there gawking, Kev? We've got all the time in the world, but your kid. He slowly raised the gun and pressed it to Danny's temple. He doesn't have the luxury of waiting. Dad? Danny's voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes were locked on mine. I clenched my teeth, my chest tightening with unbearable helplessness. Fine, I hissed. I'll pay. Victoria smiled in satisfaction and handed me the phone. That's more like it, darling. I stared at the screen, the account number glowing back at me, and felt my hands ball into fists. Confirm it, Kev, Vince reminded me, tilting the gun slightly. Or your boy's life ends right here, right now. I knew I had no choice. I pressed the button, swiped my finger across the screen, confirming the transfer. A few seconds later, $10 million vanished beyond my reach, on top of the $5 million already in the bag. It's done, I said, tossing the phone to the ground. Victoria picked it up, checked the balance, and then smiled in satisfaction. That's more like it, she purred. I looked at Danny. Now let him go. But Vince only laughed, shaking his head. Oh, Kev, you really can't be this naive. I froze, a chill running down my spine. What do you mean? You think it's that simple? Vince took a step back, keeping a firm grip on Danny's shoulder. At first, I thought I'd just take the cash and disappear, but you know what the problem is? You're too damn dangerous. You know too much. That means I have to get rid of you. That wasn't the deal. I snapped. The deal? Vinces muked. And what made you think your opinion mattered? You promised. I snarled, but the words barely left my mouth before pain exploded in my ribs. One of the thugs drove a fist into my side, and I dropped to my knees, gasping for air. Dad! Danny screamed, struggling to break free. Relax, kid, Vince chuckled. You'll live, but we're going to find you a new home. Somewhere they like kids, but not the way you'd want. Something inside me detonated. If you so much as touch him, I will kill you. You won't get the chance, pal. Vince sighed, feigning disappointment. Kill him. Slowly. I want him to feel every second of it. Victoria smirked and blew me a mocking kiss. Goodbye, darling. You weren't bad in bed, but Vince is better. I growled, but a fist smashed into my face before I could react. My head snapped back, the world spinning. I heard their footsteps fading away. Then the warehouse doors slammed shut. Well, boys, how should we start? One of the thugs growled, crouching down in front of me. He's tough. Another one mused, cracking his knuckles. Let's make it interesting. Can't have him dying too fast. I tried to move, but rough hands grabbed my arms, yanking me upright and tying me to a metal chair. The ropes bit into my wrists. My chest constricted so tightly I could barely breathe. Let's have some fun with him, the third thug sneered. I hear nails are pretty sensitive. He pulled out a pair of pliers, opening and closing them slowly right in front of my eyes. You ever felt what it's like to have your nails ripped off? I said nothing. He stepped closer and grabbed my left hand in a vice grip. Let's start with the pinky. A snap of metal. A wave of blinding pain. I gasped but didn't scream. Look at that, he's holding up. The first one laughed. All right, let's see just how tough he really is. The second thug reached into a box and pulled out a long, thin needle. Something that looked like a medical instrument. I once heard that if you shove a needle under the nail, the pain is unbearable. Want to test that theory? I clenched my teeth, bracing myself. Dad! Danny's voice rang out from somewhere beyond the door. Something inside me shattered. The needle pierced under my nail, agony ripping through my body, but I didn't scream. I wouldn't give these bastards the satisfaction. They could torture me all they wanted, but I would get out, and I would kill them all. Pain is a tool. Pain is a weapon. These idiots had no idea what they were doing. They were amateurs who thought that grabbing a man and driving a needle under his nail made them professionals. Pathetic fools. They had no idea what real pain was. But I did. I was a specialist in pain. I knew how to instill fear. I understood every vulnerable point of the human body, every weakness, every fragile threshold beyond which the mind shatters. I didn't need to break fingers or sever tendons to make a man talk. I could do it in far simpler ways. When I worked for the government, I had to infiltrate the most secure places, reach people deemed untouchable. I interrogated those who believed they were unbreakable. But in the end, they always talked. Always. And this time was no different. I focused on my breathing, on each inhale on the way the ropes bit into my wrists. They had beaten me, tortured me, but I was nowhere near my limit. When one of the bastards leaned in again, I noticed the knots binding me were too loose. Amateurs. They hadn't even thought to tie my hands behind my back. Well, still holding up, tough guy. The thug sneered, bringing a red-hot blade close to my face. I gave him a weak smile, gritting my teeth through the pain, and whispered, "You picked the wrong man, asshole." Before he could react, I jerked forward, twisting my wrist free from the ropes, and grabbed his head. With a single motion, I snapped his neck. The sickening crack of vertebrae echoed through the warehouse. The two remaining thugs froze in shock. I snatched the knife from the dead man's hand and flung it straight into the chest of the second. He crumpled, never even reaching for his weapon. That left one. He lunged for his gun, but I was faster. Grabbing the metal chair they had used to torture me, I swung it with all my strength into his legs. A grotesque crunch filled the air as his knee twisted at an unnatural angle. He screamed, collapsing to the floor in agony, but I didn't give him a chance to recover. Stepping onto his chest, I leaned down until our eyes met. "Where did Vince go?" "Go to hell," he spat in my face. I pressed my lips into a thin line. Wrong answer. I drove my elbow hard into his shattered knee. His scream tore through the warehouse as he writhed, trying to crawl away. I didn't let him. I watched him, this piece of filth squirming in pain, clutching his ruined leg. His face was twisted in agony and terror. But this was only the beginning. He didn't yet understand what real pain was. I crouched beside him, grabbed a fistful of his hair, and forced him to look at me. "I can kill you quickly, but you don't want that, do you?" I tilted my head, studying his face. "You worked for Vince. You helped kidnap children. You deserve something special." His breath came in ragged gasps, his lips trembling. "Please," he whispered, sweat dripping down his forehead. I smirked. "Oh, now you know how to beg? Where was that humility when you were jamming needles under my fingernails?" I grabbed his right hand and twisted his wrist upward. You know, the wrist is one of the body's weakest points. Right here, nerves, muscles. I ran a finger over his skin, pinpointing the exact spot. One precise cut, and your hand becomes useless. He shook his head frantically, his whole body trembling. "No, please." I picked up a jagged shard of broken glass lying nearby and slowly drove it straight through the center of his palm, piercing clean through. His scream was so loud it bounced off the warehouse walls, ringing in my ears. Sir. No need to pass out so soon," I murmured, gently patting his cheek. "We still have time." I examined his hand, severed tendons, blood pouring onto the dirty concrete. He would never make a fist again. "You bastard," he choked through his sobs. "Oh, you're still cursing? That means you can still talk." "Good." I stood and walked to the crate of tools they had brought for me. Idiots. They didn't even realize they had prepared their own torture session. At the bottom of the crate, I found a pair of old pliers. I weighed them in my hand, testing their grip. "Do you know how many pain points the human body has?" I asked, stepping back toward him. "Over 100, but the most sensitive are right here." I grabbed his face, clamping his jaw, and crushed the pliers around one of his lower front teeth. No. He thrashed, but his shattered knee and useless hand left him powerless to resist. I didn't rip the tooth out right away. I loosened it first, rocking it back and forth, savoring his howls, watching his body seize from the torment. "Talk," I said evenly. "Gee, Greenland. Vince went to Greenland. Bunker. An old military bunker. They took the boy there. That's all I know, I swear." I froze for a second, locking onto his panicked eyes. "Well, see? You could have just said that from the start." With a sharp pull, I wrenched the tooth out at the root. A sickening squelch, then a blood-curdling scream. His body convulsed, his strength draining away. "Sleep well, bastard," I muttered, and with one swift motion, I slit his throat with a glass shard. A rush of crimson spilled onto the floor, drowning out his final gasp. I stood up, wiped my bloodied hands on his clothes, and turned toward the door. Now I had a destination. Greenland. Vince. And he was going to die much slower than this scum. I stood over the cooling corpse of the last thug, breathing deep, tasting the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. Somewhere nearby, blood still dripped from his mutilated hand, but I no longer cared. The only thing that mattered now was time. Vince and Victoria wouldn't be sitting still. Vince never wasted time. That bastard was methodical, fast. While I had been dealing with his underlings, he and Victoria were probably already sipping expensive whiskey in some private terminal, laughing at their success. They thought I was dead. They thought the money was in their pockets. They thought Danny was nothing more than a new bargaining chip, a hostage meant to haunt me, a reminder of my failure. But what they didn't realize was this: I wasn't the one hunting them. Death was already at their heels. I pulled a phone from the pocket of one of the dead men and quickly checked the recent calls. One number stood out, marked to a private airport 40 kilometers from here. I gritted my teeth. Catching up to them was nearly impossible, but at the very least, I could find out exactly where they were heading. Private flights rarely left without preparation. This wasn't some commercial airline where you could just book a seat. I needed to get inside, track their flight plan, and find a way to reach them faster. I climbed into a car, still covered in blood, started the engine, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The tires screeched, leaving black streaks on the pavement, and the engine roared as I tore down the empty road. 30 minutes later, I was at the airport. I knew I couldn't just storm in and demand information with my fists. The people handling private charters were too well-trained talk. But I also knew one undeniable truth. Everyone has a weakness. I found exactly what I was looking for near the side entrance. A short, stocky mechanic stood by the service door, lazily scrolling through his phone while smoking. I moved in fast, giving him no time to react, grabbed him by the collar, and slammed him against the wall. "Vince's flight. Where is it headed?" I hissed, pressing my forearm against his throat. "SH shit. I don't know." I increased the pressure. "I'm not in the mood for guessing games. Talk, or I'll crush your trachea." "Greenland," he choked out, gasping for air. "Military airfield, near Thule. They took off 20 minutes ago, but the weather might be a delay." I released him abruptly, and he collapsed, coughing and wheezing. A military airfield. That meant they had protection, but it also meant I had a way to reach them. I turned and headed straight for the control center. Bursting inside, I ignored the shouts of startled staff, grabbed the nearest phone, and dialed an old number I hadn't used in years. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. "Who is this?" "It's Kevin," I gritted my teeth. "I need transport to Greenland. Immediately." 3 hours later, I was airborne, seated in the frigid cargo hold of an aging military transport plane. At the controls was a man who owed me his life. I stared out the window as the frozen wasteland stretched toward us. The temperature outside was -40, the wind tearing snow from the glaciers, and in the distance, silent mountain ranges loomed against the horizon. I knew I wouldn't be able to just land in Thule and ask for directions. This wasn't the kind of place where you could simply walk in. But I wasn't new to places like this. "You know where I can get weapons?" I asked the pilot. He let out a dry chuckle. "There's an old supply depot in town. Officially shut down, but the guys there will sell you anything you want. Take me there." He gave a silent nod and adjusted course. As soon as I stepped off the plane, the freezing air cut through my clothes like knives. I pulled up my hood and walked toward the small warehouse the pilot had told me about, a place that had once belonged to the Danes. The door swung open, and a grim-faced man in a fur-lined coat greeted me. "You're late." "I'm not here to talk," I said flatly. "I need weapons." He scanned me from head to toe, noting the dried blood stains on my jacket, then smirked. "You're not here on a casual visit, are you?" I silently handed him a thick stack of bills. "All right, friend. What do you need?" I considered for a moment. An assault rifle, a suppressor, a couple of handguns, and something that can make a nice explosion. He nodded and disappeared into the back of the warehouse. A few minutes later, weapons and ammunition lay neatly arranged on the table before me. I checked every round, every chamber, every firing pin. Once I was satisfied, I zipped up my coat, tucked a pistol into my waistband, and looked at the cellar. Now tell me how to get to that military bunker. He narrowed his eyes. You're going there alone? I smirked. Yeah. He shook his head. Then maybe I should sell you a coffin instead. I simply smiled. No need. I won't be the one needing it. Now I was ready. Vince and Victoria thought they had one, but they had no idea what kind of death was already following in their footsteps. I pressed myself against the frozen ground, feeling the night envelop me like a second skin. The air reeked of iron, of exhaust fumes, and something else, a sickly sweet scent of death. Not everyone walked out of this place alive. I planned to change that tradition. 100 meters ahead stood a fence, 2 meters high, lined with razor wire, with spotlights scanning the perimeter. Cameras swiveled lazily from side to side, like the tired eyes of an old watchdog. Guards? Relaxed. Relaxed meant dead. They just didn't know it yet. I narrowed my eyes. 2 on the watchtower. One sipping coffee, the other yawning, his rifle resting against his stomach. Sloppy, I muttered under my breath. 3 at the gate. 2 smoking. 1 scrolling through his phone. Modern security training. I unslung my pack, pulled out a suppressor, and screwed it onto my pistol. Time to get to work. Moving along the fence, I searched for a climbable spot. 10 meters from the watchtower, a shipping container sat abandoned. Perfect. I scaled it quickly. Patrols could return at any moment. Pulling myself up, I peered over the edge of the tower. The 2 guards were still wasting time. I fired once. The first man's head burst like a ripe melon, splattering blood across his coffee cup. Shit. The second one managed to yell before his own curse got lodged in his throat, along with my knife. I lowered his body carefully and yanked my blade free. Don't forget your milk for the trauma, I muttered, shoving his corpse into the shadows. Now the gate. I dropped down, blending into the darkness. The 2 smokers were still deep in conversation, the third glued to his phone. Dude, I'm telling you, she's just playing hard to get, one of them said, exhaling smoke. She'll come back. Screw that, the other replied. I wouldn't forgive her. They were so engrossed in their little drama that they didn't even hear me coming. 1 shot. Phone guy collapsed face first into his screen, leaving a crimson smear across it. The second tried to pull his gun, but I was already there. A swift, clean cut. His throat became a silent fountain of red. The third flicked his cigarette away, but I beat him to it. A quick spin, a punch to the solar plexus, and as he doubled over, gasping for air, I choked him out with the strap of his own rifle. Guess you didn't forgive her either, I muttered, fishing the gate keys from his pocket. The door creaked open with a dull groan. Inside, the air stank of dust, sweat, and rotting food. The lights flickered. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. The place looked just like the men who worked here, dirty, decayed, and waiting for an inevitable end. Moving swiftly from shadow to shadow, I kept my pistol raised. The hallways twisted and turned, but at the end of one, I saw a brightly lit door with glass panels. An interrogation room. Through the glass, I saw my son. A massive man in a leather jacket gripped Danny by the hair, his face battered and scarred, tattoos crawling up his neck. Old school criminal ink. He was on the phone. Yeah, he's just a kid, but I want to prep for the real world. His daddy's not going to help him anymore, so we'll ship him off, maybe for parts. What can I say? My paternal instincts are kicking in. I just love teaching kids. I took a step forward and shoved the door open. The man turned, his brain struggling to process who I was. Who the hell? A bullet through his eye cut his question short. Samenter, I muttered, lowering the gun. Danny flinched, but didn't make a sound. I crouched down and freed him. Dad, it's okay. I pulled him into a tight embrace. But footsteps were already echoing in the hallway. No, it wasn't over yet. I inhaled deeply, forcing my heartbeat into submission. My son was right here, his small body trembling, but he held himself together like a true fighter. No crying, no screaming. He knew to follow my lead. You're doing great, kid, but we need to move fast. He nodded, clenching his jaw. I almost smiled. A real warrior. I scanned the room quickly. In the corner, a ventilation shaft. Narrow, but big enough for Danny. I pried it open and peeked inside. Long enough. It led to another corridor. Listened carefully. I gripped his shoulders, locking onto his frightened eyes. Crawl through the duct until you see light. That's the way out. Wait for me there. Stay quiet. What about you? I've got work to do. His lips trembled, but he nodded. I helped him inside, secured the grate, pressing it down with my bloodstained boot, then turned toward the door. The shadows in the hallway stretched long. They were coming. I flexed my fingers and tightened the straps of my gloves. All right, you bastards, I exhaled, shifting my grip on the knife. Blood reckoning. The first one entered, big, bald, shotgun at the ready. He didn't even have time to aim before I was on him, shoving his barrel aside. The blast thundered through the wall. I drove my elbow into his cheekbone. He stumbled, off balance, and buried my knife deep into his throat. Blood gushed over my hand, warm and thick. The second man, young, fast, jumped through the doorway, but not fast enough. I grabbed him by the hair and smashed the back of his head against the wall. A sharp crack. He screamed, but I gave him no chance. I pried the shotgun from the dead man's grip and shoved the barrel into the boy's gaping mouth. Want a smoke? I smirked and pulled the trigger. His skull exploded like an overripe melon, spraying the walls with red pulp. His body collapsed, twitching in its final spasms. Threw guts to the truth. I kept moving, carving my way forward like a butcher through a slaughterhouse. In the next room, 3 of them. One got off a shot. The bullet grazed my shoulder, but I was already on him. I smashed the rifle, but into his face. His nose shattered, teeth flew in a crimson spray. Grabbing him by the hair, I lifted his ruined face to mine. Where's your boss? I growled. He tried to mumble something, but I wasn't in the mood. I jammed my fingers into his eye sockets and yanked. His screams drowned out everything as I squeezed harder, feeling his eyeballs rupture under my grip. Well, I hissed in his ear. You upstairs, the office, T-top floor. I tossed him aside and turned to the next one. He dropped his weapon, hands raised. Please, I buried my knife in his gut, twisted the blade, and yanked it free with a wet, sucking sound. A tangle of intestines spilled onto the floor, steaming in the cold air. Got it, I muttered, stepping over him. I stepped into the office, and the air thickened, heavy like the calm before a storm. Victoria lounged on a pristine white leather couch, legs crossed, a glass of wine delicately balanced in her hand. Her hair was immaculate, her plunging neckline meticulously arranged, but her eyes held no trace of the admiration they once did. Only calculation. Vince, though, he stood by the desk, gripping a knife, pale as a corpse. He knew I had survived, and he knew why I was here. I closed the door behind me, my boots squelching in the blood dripping from my clothes. The air in the room turned stifling. Vic, I said, locking eyes with her. She rolled one shoulder lazily, pretending she didn't see the mountains of bodies left in my wake. Oh, Kevin, you look. Her gaze flicked over my blood-soaked clothing, the ghosts of lives absorbed into the fabric. How did you survive? Disappointed? I smirked, taking a step forward. Vince, the cowardly bastard, tensed. His grip on the knife tightened. Good. Everything I did, Victoria exhaled, I did for us. No remorse in her voice. Just fear. A desperate attempt to keep up the facade. I turned to Vince. And you? What was it all for? He swallowed hard, licking his dry lips. It's just business, Kev. You know how this world works. I just took everything from you. You have done the same. No, I shook my head, pulling out my knife. I don't betray people I call friends. He knew there was no point in talking anymore. He lunged first. A dance of steel and blood. The blade slashed through the air. I twisted just enough to let it graze me, feeling the sting as it carved a shallow path along my skin. He was fast, but I was faster. I caught his wrist, drove my elbow into his jaw. His head snapped back, and he spat out a tooth. Still quick, I taunted, tightening my grip on my knife. And you're still a stubborn bastard, he rasped, lunging again. This time, I didn't dodge. I let his knife sink into my shoulder, biting through muscle. And in the same motion, I drove my own blade deep into his side, just beneath his ribs. He howled, stumbling back, but I grabbed him by the hair and slammed his face into the desk. "That's for my son." I lifted him and smashed him down again. Bones crunched. "That's for all the years of fake friendship." I knelt beside him, watching his body convulse in its death throes. He knew he was dying. He knew there was no escaping what was coming. But he still didn't understand how long I was going to make him suffer. I was a specialist in pain. I had studied it, broken it down, dissected the thin line between fear, agony, and madness. Vince thought he could betray me and walk away. No, he wasn't walking anywhere. He was going to learn what hell felt like, right here with me. I drew a thin blade from its sheath and, slow and deliberate, sank it into his abdomen. Not deep, just enough to sever the mesenteric arteries. Vince howled, arching his back, but I pinned his hand to the floor with another knife to keep him still. "Shh," I whispered, running a finger across his sweat-drenched forehead. "I don't want you to die quickly." A ragged, wet gurgle escaped him, his lungs filled with blood, each breath a battle. "Do you know how long a man can feel his insides rot while still alive?" I leaned close to his ear, letting my voice seep into his breaking mind. 9 hours. I took the blade and began slicing his stomach open, inch by inch. The skin parted. Dark coils of intestines spilled out, glistening in the dim light. Vince let out a strangled moan, his strength already fading. "You always wanted to be remembered, didn't you?" I murmured, severing his appendix and watching as his body convulsed in a desperate attempt to scream. I guarantee Victoria will never forget this moment. She no longer looked seductive. She trembled in the corner, curled up like a rat trapped in a cage. "K. Kevin." Vince choked, his bloody fingers clutching at my shoulder. Please." I tilted my head, studying him. "Mercy?" A low laugh rumbled from my chest. "You picked the wrong man to beg for mercy." With a swift motion, I grabbed a handful of his intestines and yanked. His body contorted in an unnatural seizure. His lungs fought for air, but all he swallowed was agony. His pupils dilated. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His limbs spasmed violently. "Does it hurt?" I whispered, holding his own insides in my palm. "Good." I twisted the length of intestine around my wrist and pulled. Vince shuddered violently, his body trembling in its final death throes. A weak, barely audible sound gurgled from his throat. I released his guts, letting them slither onto the floor in a growing pool of crimson. "Goodbye, old friend," I murmured and almost tenderly drove the blade straight into his heart, stripping him of his last chance at survival. His body slumped. I turned to Victoria. She was pale, terror-drunk, her mind shattered. Victoria was still breathing, but it wasn't the breath of the living. It was a ragged, desperate wheeze, as if her lungs had forgotten how to function. She couldn't tear her gaze away from Vince's mutilated corpse, his split-open abdomen, the intestines curling in the blood like dying snakes. I smiled and let my gaze drift to her. "Well, Vic," I flicked the blood from my knife. "Was this worth your betrayal? Was this sack of shit worth it?" She let out a strangled sob. Her eyes darted frantically across the room. She was already calculating her only escape, running. I didn't even try to stop her. She bolted, stumbling toward the door, her heel catching the edge of the carpet. But she caught herself, driven purely by survival instinct. I tilted my head, watching as fear turned her into an animal, ready to charge through fire just to get away from me. "Careful, Vic," I called after her with a smirk. "Don't slip." She wasn't listening. She tore down the hallway, leaping over bodies, but her heels skidded on a pool of blood. She fell forward, straight onto the shattered glass of the broken window. A dull, sickening crunch made me blink slowly. She froze in place, her body twisted at a grotesque angle. A jagged shard of glass jutted from her chest, embedded deep into her heart. I strolled into the hallway, hands casually tucked into my pockets. "Well, I did warn you." I sighed, shaking my head. Victoria wheezed, her mouth filling with blood, staining her lips bright red. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, begging for help. I crouched down in front of her, interlocking my fingers. "Listen, Vic," I shrugged. I could do a lot of things, but heart surgery isn't one of them. She gasped, body convulsing. The shard lodged deeper. A thick surge of blood gushed from her lips. Oh dear, I murmured. There it goes again. Her eyes darkened, and I watched the last flickers of life sputter out like a dying light bulb. She crumpled onto the floor, just another puddle of blood in this corridor of death. I exhaled slowly and stood. And that was that. As they say, Vic, run while you still can, not when it's already too late. I surveyed the carnage, the corpses, the blood-drenched ruin I had left behind. There was only one thing left to do. Get Danny and leave this place behind. That night, we drove away. I gripped the steering wheel while Danny, wrapped in my old army coat, dozed quietly in the passenger seat. His breathing was even peaceful. He felt safe again. I kept my eyes on the road, but the images still flashed in my mind. Victoria, her chest impaled. Vince, gurgling his last breath. Blood, guts, screams. All of it was behind us now, burning in the darkness. Dad, a small voice murmured from beneath the coat. I glanced at Danny. He squinted against the street lights streaming through the window. You're awake? I tried to sleep. He bit his lip. Where are we going now? I exhaled, turning my gaze back to the road. Somewhere no one can ever hurt us again. Danny nodded. He was still too young to understand that men like me don't deserve a quiet life. But he was my son, and I would do everything to make sure he grew up without fear. A new life 3 years passed. I chose a small town by the coast, a place where no one cared about anyone's past. Bought a house, modest, cozy, with a garden and an ocean view. Every morning, I woke before dawn, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and stepped onto the terrace, listening to the waves. Danny grew. Each year, the fear in his eyes faded. He laughed again. He could be a child again. He went to school, made friends, and I ran my business remotely, no longer needing to kill. I kept a low profile. Dad, look. Danny ran out of the house, a ball in his hands. You promised. I smiled, setting my tools aside. All right, champ, let's see what you've got. We played in the yard until sunset, his laughter filling the world. And you know what? I didn't need another woman. I didn't need love. I didn't need family. Maybe one day, I'd let someone in again. But I wasn't in a hurry, because I was already happy, because my son was growing up strong, and because I knew if the world ever tried to take him from me again, I would burn it to the ground.